Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in and listening to me today. My name is Noah DeGraff, and I am very excited to share something with you that I think is becoming increasingly essential in our modern day ELA classrooms. And this is teaching multimodal critical literacy through graphic novel adaptations. And so the text that I'm using to kind of anchor our conversation today is Fido Nesti's graphic adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. Now, even if you don't teach 1984 or you haven't read Orwell's original novel, or maybe you don't use graphic novels very often in your classroom, maybe your district just isn't too sure about where to put them in just yet. I want to reassure you before we get started that what I'm talking about today is flexible and can be scaffolded to teach really any complex text as we prepare students to read in the world that they're actually living in. So without further ado, I'm going to start getting into it. But before I lay it all out, here's kind of where I'm headed. We're going to start by talking about why multimodal literacy matters right now and why graphic novel adaptations, specifically texts like Nesti's 1984, deserve a place in the academic classroom. I'm going to walk through what the research actually says about graphic novels because there is a lot of scholarship that I feel like many teachers might not have been exposed to just yet. Then I'm going to dig into how Fido Nesti's adaptation uses visual design to teach concepts that can sometimes be abstract or, emotionally distant in Orwell's traditional prose text. And then from there, we're going to look at a few different teaching strategies, like how to scaffold multimodal reading, and a few classroom activities that I thought of in this particular context, and then how these texts support equity and access for all kinds of diverse learners. I do want to make it clear here, though, that my goal with this is not to convince anyone to replace classic text with graphic adaptations. I personally think that George Orwell's novel is a classic and a beautifully written book, and I have no authority to tell you that you should get rid of it or anything like that. Yes, the irony is real there. But I do want to show you how teaching both modes together can kind of build students' critical literacy in ways that really aren't possible with just the prose text alone. And so I'm here to show you that graphic novels aren't shortcuts at all, but they add just as much rigor and depth to what we're already reading and working on in the classroom already. So I'm going to begin with the basics of multimodal literacy. If you've worked with any level of students in recent times or really just lived in the 21st century, you know that we are constantly swimming in visual media, from TikTok to memes to YouTube, advertising, infographics, political messaging. It's literally everywhere. And at this point, we really don't see an endpoint. Nonetheless, most of the literacy work that we're doing in schools is still centered in the alphabetic text, which for a generation that's kind of developed primarily around screens is not as beneficial as it once was. Sean Connors writes, a growing number of literacy educators acknowledge the importance of creating opportunities for students to think critically about the interactions with multimodal text. And he's right. Students aren't lacking literacy. They're working their way through complex multimodal environments all the time. What they are lacking is the structured opportunities to make meaning from those modes with a real purpose and intention. He also points out that few empirical studies have asked how actual readers interact with their multimodal design to construct a literary meaning, which to us as teachers means that we're still trying to figure out the best practices and strategies to teach graphic novels in the classroom. But my point here is fairly simple, in that visual literacy can't be optional anymore. It is a part of being a critical reader and a modern citizen. So in the context of why we should use graphic novels in the classroom, it's because they virtually check every box of strengthening students' multimodal literacy. They require students to integrate everything from images to text, design, sequence, symbolism, and perspective all in one space at one time. And so I have two quotations that I've listed here on this slide that I included because they amplify what I'm talking about. The first is from scholar Adam Bessie, as he writes that educators and librarians have shifted perspectives, recognizing graphic novels as valuable tools for engaging reluctant readers and enhancing literacy skills. And the second is from Sean Connors again, as he writes, a growing number of literacy educators acknowledge the importance of creating opportunities for students to think critically about the interactions with multimodal texts. So if anyone ever suggests that graphic novels are less academic, we're clearly seeing the opposite of that here. These texts are layered and they're rich and they align pretty perfectly, in my opinion, with what modern literacy actually requires, which is flexible and multimodal student interpretations. And before I get too carried away with all of this, I do want to address one misconception of graphic novels, or specifically like graphic novel adaptations being labeled as simplifications of the original texts. That is not the case at all. These texts are clear interpretations of the original text. And each and every panel is a deliberate choice as to what to emphasize or what to minimize in the text. What mood we're constructing, which themes deserve visual weight, what kind of symbolic details will guide the reader's emotional and intellectual responses. The list goes on and on. Scholar James Bucky Carter makes this point very clear in his essay when he writes that with the growing understanding of the importance of critical literacy, visual literacy, and other types of literacy that were once considered alternate, more attention has been paid to graphic novels. He's not specifically saying that they're diluted versions of the classic literature, right? He's saying that these texts can reach students who need those multimodal pathways to understand the complex ideas that we're asking them to grasp, and that they're not really going to get from that traditional prose text. I also think in general that all students are benefiting in some way when we give them multiple ways to access and enter a text to understand what it's asking or what it's saying. So you might be asking yourself why I am focusing this entire project on Fido Nesti's 1984. Well, it's because talking about this idea freely won't give you the kind of clear examples that I see represented in this adaptation. When we read Orwell's original text, specifically the themes of surveillance, ideological control, propaganda, and psychological manipulation, all of these things are abstract and conceptual. They live like deep inside of the tone and in the tension and in the mood, which is beautiful in the original text, but for many young readers today, it can be extremely difficult to pick up on, let alone really understand on an analytical level. And so Nesti's novel makes those very same abstractions visible to the reader. He turns the paranoia into the framing in the way that it lays out on the spread. He turns the authoritarianism into the color schemes that he uses. He turns the newspeak and cognitive control into written violence. And I'll get into all of this a little bit further in the slides. But he's helping students to see the mechanisms of totalitarian power and not just read about them through prose. And so because of that, teaching Nesti's adaptation alongside Orwell's work can become more of a powerful lesson in meaning and how meaning is constructed across entirely different modalities. I'm going to start here by focusing on some of the specific areas that we could teach while using the text as a tool. And one of the biggest advantages of graphic adaptations is how they can reveal ideologies visibly. Devika Panikar writes that the images in Fido's 1984 shape how readers perceive and interpret power dynamics. And so when you think about it, that's exactly what visual propaganda does in the real world. We're shaping our understandings without requiring any kind of rational argument. And so students are beginning to see that kind of process happening. We're seeing graphic novels are making the invisible visible by externalizing power structures so that students can analyze them and rather than like absorb them freely, or most commonly when we're reading prose texts, let it slide right over their heads. So, right here is where this multimodal literacy becomes this critical literacy. So if we're teaching graphic novel adaptations, we can give students a whole new set of analytical tools as they look at things in the novel, like the framing. So in this specific adaptation, it would be like where the eye is drawn on the spread and who has the power in the scene. Color in the text signifies emotional, psychological, and ideological cues. The typography and font can show to students how the words themselves can become the propaganda. Symbolism is shown like throughout the entire novel with recurring motifs like the eyes and the screens and the shadows that lurk both behind the characters and the buildings. And just the overall composition as well being like what is dominated, which is clearly shown in the one that's on the slide currently, what's being pushed to the margins or what's being completely disregarded as a whole. All of these things are rhetoric, right? They're a kind of analysis because it's all about the author's craft. And I think that students can have some really insightful ideas once they're taught how to read these visual cues. In both Orwell's novel and Nesti's adaptation, propaganda is everywhere. The entire environment is saturated in posters and slogans and the Big Brother's image. And in her essay that's specifically about Fido's adaptation, Panikar writes that the use of changing language and controlling thoughts comes out clear in the graphic novel through the smart and effective use of pictures and texts. And all of this is intentional. The party doesn't persuade through any kind of reason in the novel. It persuades through its like saturation and forced visibility, right? You can't open the page and miss it. The graphic novel shows how that functions. The minimal words on the spread oftentimes become an act of like weaponization. Visual repetition becomes a tool of control. And so through all of these things working together, students can kind of begin to trace how the propaganda fills the landscape and setting of 1984. The motif of surveillance, again, in Nesti's adaptation, becomes really psychological, which was probably one of my favorite parts of the novel. The screens that he illustrates are drawn like unblinking eyes that are constantly watching over our characters in the city. And the panels throughout the spreads are tightening around our protagonist's body, which makes the reader also feel kind of suffocated. Even down to the buildings, they're very geometric as they're illustrated in the novel. They're angular and they tower over our characters. The way that Panikar describes this in her essay is the claustrophobic framing, the heavy shadows, and the stark lining. So, when students are opening this text, they're immediately grasping how this surveillance feels, and not just how Orwell is describing it. And once they're seeing both of these things working together, they can analyze it in similar ways as one would do with the prose original text alone. Also, the coloring that's used throughout the novel is one of the strongest rhetorical tools in Nesti's adaptation. He's using muted grays and browns to dominate the entire world. So he's visually communicating to the reader that kind of stagnation and that hopelessness that we get from Orwell's novel. He also uses abrupt flashes of red to signal anger and danger and violence, or the forced ideologies that Winston comes across, which is pretty hard to miss as a reader in this adaptation. The quote that I want to bring up here is different than the one that I have listed on the screen, but I love the way that Panikar states, the dull color scheme brings on the visual effect of the stagnation and repression. And I don't think that students often realize how powerfully color can shape an emotion in a text. So a graphic novel adaptation like this one can make that rhetorical work really concrete and explicit for our students. The last area that I want to focus on in this section is how great the graphic novel can visualize an internal conflict, which I think can be one of the most difficult things to analyze as a student. And so throughout Nesti's adaptation, Winston's face and his posture and the tension that we see in his eyes are all kind of communicating this kind of resistance or fear or longing in ways that the prose novel can't always capture. We can read all kinds of descriptions of characters' features and their expressions and still never really settle on a perfect image as a collective. Panikar explains how Nesti's novel reveals the nature of how the words of the author controlled the consciousness of the character. And so students are analyzing these microaggressions and they can see how propaganda works on an individual body. And through this adaptation, they can literally point in the book to the exact moment where Winston breaks down. So now that we're looking at some of the spreads that are in the book, and we're kind of grasping how Fido Nesti shapes his novel, this is where everything starts to come together. When students are engaging with multimodal texts, they're practicing drawing a conclusion or an opinion across different modalities. Students are comparing what the image says versus what the prose is saying, which will get them to start questioning, Orwell's original text and the artist's choices. They're going to start to become more aware of how their perspective and the author's designs can shape their interpretations as they're reading. I also want to include this quote because I think it's beautifully written, that graphic novels help the reader see the consequences of totalitarianism more vividly in their hearts. And so it's this kind of like emotional vividness that we're talking about. It's far from a shortcut. if anything, it's a doorway that opens up to much deeper critical literacy for our students. Again, I just want to re-anchor what we're talking about back into research. One of the essays that I was working pretty heavily with for this project is Sean Connor's. It's titled Weaving Multimodal Meaning in a Graphic Novel Reading Group. Basically, the essay discusses a study that he completed with 6 high school students in an after-school reading group. They read 4 different graphic novels, and he was trying to figure out how students interact with the multimodal design of graphic novels. And so Connors found that when students discussed the graphic novels, they wove multimodal meaning as they discussed the texts. I love that sentence. These students that were reading the books weren't just passive observers when it came to reading, but they were actively interpreting what they were seeing and what they were reading as they were doing it. And so this aligns with some of the other scholarship that I've read, all of which reiterate the fact that graphic novels improve comprehension, interpretation, and engagement for a wide range of learners. The evidence that I found was a lot, and it was pretty intimidating, if I'm being honest, but they all kind of draw to the same conclusion that graphic novels support literacy development across the board. One of the major reasons that I was interested in this topic is how much access graphic novels can offer our students. Downey writes that graphic novels help reach reluctant readers and visual learners and improve comprehension and interpretation, which is backed up in Bessie's essay, which he writes that many librarians and teachers believe graphic novels are a means of engaging reluctant or resistant readers. I personally don't think that this is entirely just about motivating our students. It is, but it's also about equity. Graphic novels are already scaffolded with visual and spatial and emotional cues that can help struggling readers, also multilingual learners, and neurodivergent students as well. But they can also challenge advanced readers, as multimodal analysis is definitely not an easy skill to master. Also, some of the symbolic elements can be pretty sophisticated in this adaptation. So, with all of that being said, you might be asking yourself how we can go about teaching these kinds of texts with the attention that we've once and have been giving to more traditional kinds of literature. But I think that what I have listed here on this slide is some of the most important focuses. Teaching visual grammar with the panels, the gutters, and the perspectives, so that students are comfortable working with likely a new medium. For a lot of our students, these might be their first graphic novel, or for most of our students, this is the first graphic novel that they've seen inside of an English curriculum, right? Multimodal close reading is just as important in any kind of genre, but specifically when reading graphic novels. Using annotation strategies that are specific to visuals, and I'm going to get into that more, I believe, on the next slide. And comparing prose and visual versions of scenes and focusing discussions on specific design elements can help students kind of compare their likely different interpretations of the text, and the text and the images. And I want to make it clear that none of these are replacing traditional literacy, right? We are only deepening what we've already been working towards with the original book for years on end now. The next few slides, I wanted to include some possible classroom activities that could be used when working alongside Orwell and Fido's novels. The panel annotation is the first one that I have listed because I think it is one of the simplest, but one of the most effective reading strategies. So in this context, students would end up marking up different coloring choices. They could comment on the framing, the expressions, the font choices, the symbolism, or really anything that they're observing that carries some kind of meaning for them. I myself have been guilty at times of zooming through different graphic novels because they can feel lighter to read. But this kind of activity slows down our visual processing so that we're really taking the time to analyze the smaller details that are intentionally put in there by Nesti and included throughout the text. I also think that a lot of students who struggle with traditional kinds of annotations with prose would thrive with this kind of visual annotation because the cues are so much more concrete and explicit and easy to access for our students. I I also think that one of the most beneficial lessons for our students is having them draw comparisons between moments in Orwell's original text and then how it's represented in Nesti's interpretation or adaptation. This kind of framework aligns with almost word for word, what the a few of the Common Core New York State standards say as well, where students can analyze what's being added, what's being shifted, or what changes emotionally when it's seen as visualized for you. So students are beginning to frame questions that are questioning why Nesti made the choices that he did, while also questioning why Orwell framed those sentences the way that he did, and questioning like what the illustration is emphasizing and why. Right, these kinds of skills are helping students understand that really any kind of literature is constructed. While writing, someone made those game-changing choices, and then those decisions are the ones that are shaping our understanding and the meanings that we're getting from what we're reading. This next activity kind of connects directly to media literacy and what students will come into contact with in the real world if they haven't already. Downey writes that studying a graphic novel can bring media literacy into the curriculum as students examine the medium itself. So, using Nesti's propaganda scenes and pairing them with some real examples that students engage with, sometimes almost daily, like the advertising, political posters, or brand messaging, students are seeing how to understand and make meaning from the messages that are shown to them outside of our classrooms. They can analyze anything from the font, the layout, color, symbolism, repetition in the novel. I think this activity would get students to start to see propaganda not just in 1984, but in the world around them as well. The last activity that I included is really just a fun and creative one, but I also do think that it takes a level of analytical skill, so I thought it might be fun to include. In this, students would be creating a missing panel for a moment in Orwell's original text that Nesti chose not to include in his adaptation. So in order to complete this assignment well, our students would have to, really interpret the scene in prose in its original form, and then to choose one of the most important visual symbols, make a decision on the framing that they want, consider the emotional tone, the color of the scene, which to me is a pretty deep focus for just one scene, but that's how rich these kind of activities can be when working with graphic novels. I think activities like these, they don't just show us how well our students are understanding the original texts, which they do, but they're also showing us how well they're able to apply their multimodal thinking to that as well. I think it really goes without saying that there are a lot of teachers that are hesitant when choosing graphic novels or bringing them into the curriculum or including them in classroom on a more substantial role. In our essay, Downey shares that those who are unfamiliar with the format will most likely skim the novel and misinterpret the intent of the artist and the author. Like I mentioned before, I think this is true for both adults and students. I've been guilty of zooming through graphic novels because they do feel lighter to read, but I don't think the solution to this here is avoiding the genre entirely, right? It's making sure that we're teaching them effectively. We've been teaching how to read prose and how to analyze written literature. We should also be teaching how to read images as well. Graphic novels don't have to be replacements for traditional texts that we're comfortable with in our curriculum, that have been cycled through for generations, but they can act as extensions for them. I didn't want to include some of the possible classroom activities without also sharing some of the levels of assessment, because these can also be multimodal too. Just looking at some of the examples that I've included here, these are just a few with the annotated panels, the comparative essays and visual rhetoric reflections, the vocabulary building and image pairing, student created propaganda if they made their own posters, and then presenting with oral analysis of their panel designs or whatever. These kinds of assessments offer multiple different access points for students to demonstrate their understanding. And they're also showing a much deeper thought process that's kind of difficult to get from just formative assessments using the prose novel. I don't want to linger too long on the New York State standards, but I do want to mention that the graphic novel supports pretty much every single ELA standard. The students are analyzing the author and the artist's choices. They're evaluating rhetorical techniques. They're comparing across modes. They're engaging in discussions, writing analysis, interpreting figurative languages, symbols, themes, tones. Again, I could go on and on. They also meet multimodal comprehension standards that I think are becoming much more central to the classroom as digital literacy and technology in education become the norm. I know that this is quite a bit of information to throw at you in one video, but we should talk about why this is so important, right? Every single one of us live in a world that is full of images and full of propaganda. Our students are navigating persuasive design constantly, whether they're aware of it or not. But the problem here is that if we only teach them how to read alphabetic and traditional texts, we're not really preparing them for the kind of media environments that they are surrounded by outside of the classroom. And so graphic adaptations like Nesti's 1984 can help students develop the literacy skills that they need right now, and not just for school and not just for English, but for real, genuine citizenship outside of school. And so if you take anything with you from our conversation today, I do hope that you're walking away with this, in that graphic adaptations are rigorous and multimodal texts. Nesti's 1984 makes the themes of power and ideology very visible to our reader, and multimodal literacy leads to and is a part of critical literacy. Also, graphic novels can expand access for all kinds of students while also being just as rigorous as traditional texts, and that by teaching across different modes, we can deepen our understanding of both mediums, both alphabetical and visual texts. If 1984 isn't your jam, or if you're interested in other adaptations of traditional texts, I filled this slide with 10 different examples, and I am sorry if it's hard on the eyes. These are all texts that have been adapted and illustrated into graphic novels. These are titles that range from Jane Eyre to Frankenstein to, The Great Gatsby, and the list really goes on and on. But I also want to note that, or more so to emphasize that, this discussion focuses mostly on using graphic novels that have been adapted from traditional texts. That's what all of these are. But the limits for what graphic novels can do in your own classroom are endless. There are thousands of beautiful visual stories that have a place on your classroom shelves. And understanding how to teach and use them as academic tools is really only the first step. As I mentioned before, these are some of the citations and scholarship that I've worked closely with while working through this project. They were all wonderful essays, and I implore you to read them. They're all very insightful into the ways in which we can use graphic novels in our modern classrooms. And then the second slide is just the references that I used for this presentation. And I also just want to say a big thank you for listening and joining me. I had such a fun time putting all of this together and recording this. And I hope that this conversation could spark some fun ideas or give you confidence, or maybe just inspire you to bring these kinds of multimodal texts into your classroom. I would love to keep the conversation growing, maybe collaborate or explore some additional resources. So feel free to reach out to me or comment on this video, and we can open up this conversation to be so much more. But for now, that is all I have, and I will see you next time.